Okay, are we good to go? Sitting comfortably. Then I shall begin. So I'm going to talk to you really now about specifics, because in the first week we articulated the parameters, the discourse, the kind of philosophy behind Arte Útil and its friends and relations. And I'm really going to talk to you now in terms of specific experience. And the image, by the way, is kind of for fun, but also deadly serious in that for me, as a director of a museum, I think we need to begin thinking about how we make our arts institutions and our artistic frameworks work for now, for the urgencies, as we have in our criteria, to really have an effect in what's at stake in the world right now. And I begin, if I'm not moving slides. Ooh, it's just a bit slow. There we go. Okay. This is Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, MIMA for short, as I said last week, because it wanted to be like a mini MoMA. That was its ambition. And this is the glamorous, shiny photo from the day that it opened, as opposed to the reality of how it is now. And I took over this museum nearly 3 years ago, really with a ticket to transform it, or to begin to change it, because it's had a short history. It was built 10 years ago, and it was established at a time of kind of millennial hope and millennial optimism, when every town, city in the country, in the UK, but also internationally, wanted its contemporary art museum, its Guggenheim, its contemporary art center. the institution that signaled symbolically that you were a player in the world, that your town was up to speed with what was happening in the world, that it was doing the right things, that it understood contemporary culture, that it was somehow multicultural, that it was operating at an international level. And so institutions like this were rolled out across the globe. We see them now in China, in India, in the Middle East, as symbolic gestures of culture and what that offers. But the reality is, certainly in Middlesbrough, I'm going to talk about specifics now, is a town like most places in the world, a town that was built on industry. It was a steel town. Interestingly, it was originated in around about 1830, kind of a bit like a gold rush town. So there was a farm there of about 40 people, and then they discovered coal and iron ore, and then the rest is history. It exploded, creating one of the largest steelworks in Europe. And the town is built upon that very idea. But subsequently, in recent years, in what we might call the post-2007 moment, the harsh effects of that period of industrialization and its demise have taken its toll on the town. Only 10 years since MEMA opened, and since that particular moment of the economic crash, we had Brexit in the UK. Britain's referendum was held to decide whether Britain should stay or leave the European Union. And this is a map of Britain, which shows the voting pattern. And it's very handily a very good picture to show where MEMA, Middlesbrough, is on the map. So Middlesbrough is here. This is Scotland. This is England, Wales. MEMA is, Middlesbrough is here. And this is Middlesbrough, the darkest spot on the map, which shows the highest intensity of Brexit voting. So Middlesbrough has one ward that voted 82% for Brexit, which is the highest ward in the country. And the reason for that is essentially, as I see it, because this post-industrial community felt they had lost out to globalization, and particularly in regard to the steelworks. So this is the steelworks in 2014, which you can see for miles. You could guide you could navigate home at night by the steelworks, by the glow in the sky, employing thousands and thousands of people with a knock-on effect with subsidiary industries. And in 2015, it closed for good because its owners, SSI from Thailand, could no longer sustain the market due to China dumping large amounts of steel. And the British government, the right-wing Tory government, refused to step in and take control because it was against their ideology. They needed to maintain the free market. So the steelworks is now gone for good. You can never restart it again due to basically the technology around steel production. Once the heat is lost from the furnaces, etc., that's it. You can never restart. You may as well build another one. So this had a major impact on the region. Similarly, the knock-on effect of that creates Middlesbrough, often quoted as Britain's Detroit. This is kind of our equivalent of the Rust Belt. And along with that comes urban deprivation, houses being demolished, a lack of clarity, a kind of waiting situation, if you like, combined with a high migrant population. Now, this is not by default, this is kind of by design. And in last year, Middlesbrough hit the national and even European news headlines because a lot of migrant residents were being targeted for abuse because it was noticed they were all housed in buildings with red doors. Now, again, this was not necessarily policy, but what unraveled was that basically the British government Home Office, which is like the Department of Home Affairs, had subcontracted the management of refugees and asylum seekers to a multinational company called Group 4, who had then also subcontracted its rehousing strategies to large-scale landlords. And one of those landlords was a company based in Middlesbrough who were buying up large swathes of very cheap housing stock for the purpose of accommodating migrants and asylum seekers, for which they could get 40 UK pounds sterling per night per asylum seeker. And they just happened to have one tin of paint, and it was easy just to maintain all the houses with one particular color. So this is kind of aesthetics in play, if you like. So in a way, this creates a situation of Middlesbrough maybe having some of the most acute circumstances of our moment manifest, visible in a town of about 120,000 people, in a conurbation of around 750,000. So not a huge city, but certainly a place in the world that is much like any other. So the question for me is, what role, what function does a museum have in those circumstances? What role does contemporary art have in these extreme circumstances? Now, obviously, MIMA as an institution was built with a kind of touch of glamour to bring tourism, to signal another direction, to signal regeneration. But the language in which it did this was not one that was necessarily having any traction with the local residents. So when I started 3 years ago, there was a mayoral election in the town, and there was an independent candidate running for mayor on a close MIMA down ticket. It was elitist, it was snobbish, as he described it. The people didn't need it. We don't need contemporary art. This is kind of the refrain you get when you leave the metropolitan centres and you move into the world. The language of contemporary art is, as we were discussing before, so removed from its daily usage, from our daily usage, from ordinary life, that it becomes hard really to justify this contraption that has evolved under very particular circumstances, but has become so far removed from society. So last week we talked about this paradigm, and I think it's probably worth looking again at maybe another story, a longer story about how this paradigm evolved. And I use this image virtually in every single presentation I do. And it is, if you don't know, it's a painting by Caspar David Friedrich called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1818, and was the first image that I studied as an art history student, coincidentally, studying romantic art of the 18th and 19th century. And for me, this is something that I repeatedly describe as the box cover image for the software of modernity. So this image encapsulates basically all the aspects of modernity that we have inherited. It is the male, sole, genius artist striding above the landscape with his back to us, but looking beyond, leading us to some other future in which we will follow. This is the model of the avant-garde, of the artist leading us. This is why they're called, in military terms, the avant-garde, taking us forward. But also, this is an image of uncertainty and an image of critique as well. These paintings were conceived at a moment when art was really being taken out of use and operating within its own terms. And here we can see a picture of Immanuel Kant, who we might describe as the software engineer of modernity, who described aesthetics under the kind of the polarity of purposeless purpose. So the job of art is not to have a job, if you like, and the disinterested spectator. And what that means, these terms are in the lexicon as well, so we can read about those. But the disinterested spectator is somebody who detaches their own personal interests and concerns before they engage with the work of art. So you only engage with the work of art on the terms of the artist and the object. you are removing yourself from all the baggage, like, did you get your bills paid? Have I got enough food to eat? What's the politics of the day? All these things are left behind in order to engage with the object of contemplation. And this duality is what has set up our condition of modernity. It coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which created an art market. It coincided with the decline of belief within the European tradition, certainly, and rides on the back of empiricism. And is also a kind of critique of empiricism as well, that in somehow is creating some sort of spiritual realm in which art can operate. And at the same time, this idea of art as autonomous, that is created, of separate from the world, also begins to create the idea of the institution that is similarly separate from the world, the museum. So in a way, this is the trajectory that we're talking about. And I think maybe there's a diagram that I have employed very often to illustrate this. So I can do my teacher bit. And in trying to find a way out of this, where's the speaker? I'll move away in a second. Right, I'll step away from there. So, for a while, we've been contemplating the idea of how to escape this entrapment of modernity. This is a project that I was involved with back in 2004 at PS1 in New York, called Romantic Detachment, which was kind of like a crazy kind of occupation of the museum with over 37 artists, all conflicting, competing in the same space to dissolve the idea of the autonomous artist. And this was, in a way, one of the first attempts at doing that. And here's sort of that. Back in 2012, we were doing napkin drawings of saying, how can we somehow get out of beyond the curve? So if you imagine this is what we might call the parabola of modernity, that you have some kind of idea of improvement, of growth, of success, of ambition, of even confidence emerging from the 18th century. And we highlight the year 1848 in that this is the year of the French Revolution, and really the moment when capitalism gets into its full stride. At the end of the curve, we might say the end of this moment is 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism, the beginnings of people talking about the end of history and terms like this, but also the creation of the World Wide Web. So within this arc, which coincidentally at its peak around about 1907 is Les Dames d'Avignon by Picasso, and Albert Einstein's classical theory E equals mc squared. So the question was, beyond 2012, which is the moment we were discussing these ideas, how could we move forward beyond and escape this capture, this idea of art that was contained by modernity, and this idea of art that was only ever understood in terms of autonomy? And could we begin to think of other ways in which we construct an art institution, other ways in which we begin to construct a model for art to operate for more effect, for more people, for more benefit, if you like, a redistribution of creativity when that idea of creativity had been captured by a certain sector of society. So really, myself, along with a lot of other institutions, and I guess the people affiliated with this project called Arte Útil, began to look at other historical moments before the curve, about what happened before the museum that was concerned with extraction, what happened before the museum as a waiting room. And certainly in the UK, I began to look at those histories around about the same time, around about 1800, or the early 19th century, when the institution did not differentiate between art and science, did not differentiate between high and low, did not necessarily differentiate between craft, design, technology, education, society, that all these things were still thought of holistically before really the market took hold of this art economy. So for example, things like the coffee houses of the late 1700s began to form into institutions which initially were places where the educated would gather to learn about all aspects of life and to develop knowledge and technology. This is the Royal Institution in London. But at the same time, another type of institute emerged, and this was called the Mechanics Institute. And mechanics meant not necessarily mechanical as in mechanical engineers, it meant of the hand. So this was an institution, a place of learning, which was to learn about how to develop through doing, rather than through necessarily purely intellectual academic pursuits. And they originated in 1800 by George Birkbeck, who really, he was a medical student. And he realized in his studies in Glasgow, in Scotland, that he couldn't find the right glassware that he needed for his experiments in the laboratory. So he began working with artisans, with kind of ordinary workers, if you like, to help him design the new glassware. And what he realized is that they didn't really have the knowledge about the technology in order to design the implements. So he began teaching the technology and the breakthroughs in science and so on in order for the workers to begin to be able to make the tools necessary for these advancements. And what he realized was the differential that had emerged in the preceding years between those who have the knowledge and those who have the means to make. So he began basically creating this as a free night class to workers. It was free education for the working classes. And very quickly, this idea spread rapidly, because on the one hand, it allowed the industrialists to turbo boost the Industrial Revolution. So this increase in knowledge created, in a way, the emancipated worker, the worker who could really become entrepreneurial, become experimental. Could they themselves become the creators of the next inventions and would power Britain, into its sort of kind of future prosperity. So on the one hand, these institutions were instrumental, but at the same time, they were also altruistic, because this was part and parcel of a new deal for the working classes to educate them, to provide them with culture, to provide them with knowledge, with communal places of meeting. So this is the Manchester Mechanics Institute, gives you an idea. This is the Leeds Mechanics Institute, and you probably can't see on this image. But what it demonstrates is the institutes were not just about science and technology. So alongside steam engines and geology classes, there were art classes, flower arranging, sewing, textiles, you name it. There were classes in everything. And they didn't differentiate between men or women. So this was one of the first places that women could learn in public, where they could convene with society as a whole. And they could also gain new knowledge in the technologies. This is a science lab in the Swindon Mechanics Institute. Life drawing classes, fashion shows. And very quickly, this idea spread not just in the UK, where there were over 750 mechanics institutes, but also in the Anglophile world. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and the US. And this is your very own Mechanics Institute here in San Francisco, which is about 3 blocks that way. They do tours on a on a Wednesday at 1 p.m. if you're interested, free tours. That's inside the Mechanics Institute. And what was also fascinating for me about this particular moment was not only was it, on the one hand, you created this kind of instrumental institution that was really transforming the workforce, transforming knowledge, but by the very fact that it was the place where people congregated, it was also where they created some kind of space for themselves. So the institutes also became the birthplace of unionization, of the cooperative movement, of women's liberation, of reorganization of society as the West moved from an agrarian culture to an industrial one. These really these were the places where people came together to be creative and where art and science were not seen as separate, but equally supportive of one another. Culminating, for example, in things like this, which is the Great Exhibition of 1851 in Crystal Palace in London. If you're in your sort of curator studies world, a seminal moment in the history of exhibiting. But it interestingly formed from the drive, the focus, and the content of the Mechanics Institute movement. And also very interestingly, at this very same moment, when the Libraries Act came in, a lot of the institutes were converted into public libraries, into museums, into exhibiting halls. So in a way, they began to become something else, and ultimately, many of the institutes became universities around the world, and the origins of our university structures. So in a way, it's a bit of a lost moment in the history of art, in the history of society, and not something that's really talked about, because it's kind of also a story that's been suppressed, like many stories I'm going to talk about, which is about this idea of holistic working, about communal working, about the moments when the best intentions of modernity came together and worked for society, but very often that coming together worked against the ideology of capitalism. Looking again at kind of the voices round about the same time, the other kind of key aspect I'm going to introduce is this figure. This is John Ruskin, who was born in 1818, died in 1900, and again is a kind of key figure in the history of art, but also in education. If you talk to educationalists, they go, "Oh yeah, John Ruskin, the educationalist," and I didn't know he was an artist. And conversely, if you talk to art people about John Ruskin, they know him mostly as a critic, but not necessarily as an educator. But the story that's told about Ruskin primarily is that he was the key promoter of Turner. This is a painting by Turner from the National Gallery, and really Turner's promotion by Ruskin, against all odds, you know, people at the time said, "Oh, you're crazy, this is an art," etc., etc., but begins the trajectory of formalism that culminates in the Alfred Barr's diagram of the history of art at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But essentially, the story that is ascribed to Ruskin is that of the formal development of art, of his role within it. His secondary role that he's known for is as initiator of the arts and crafts movement. Really his writings, because he was one of the most prolific writers, and some of his texts are in your reading list, but they're just too voluminous to talk about here. Basically his writings based upon medieval culture and the role of art in medieval society before industrialization basically created the movement that was the arts and crafts movement. But that in itself became a story about formal development. The story we're told in art history is one of how these forms developed and incorporated into the grand narrative of art. The story here that is suppressed is that ultimately John Ruskin was a social reformer. What he was talking about essentially was the way society should operate. He was an economist, but he viewed economy not as a fiscal economy, but as a way of maintaining the world and maintaining society. And in that economy, he saw art as the fundamental tool. And very early on, he states that art is not for its own sake, but is a tool for social change, pretty much in those words. And what's hidden is the role that Ruskin played in really driving forward an idea of art embedded into the ordinary, into the everyday, into working lives, into the broadest population. This is a lecture diagram from 1872 on a lecture that Ruskin gave on the development of tree twigs. A rather famous lecture, and he kind of lost the plot because he did sort of have mental problems later on in life. But it was also part of that accusation that Ruskin was kind of crazy, was part of this suppression of the ideas that he was proposing. So, for example, in 1878, he gave a lecture called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, basically the first treatise on global warming through industrial pollution on record. And he was essentially an ecologist. And I think it's also, ecology is something we should introduce quite a lot in terms of in this kind of way of thinking, in that I see it as a kind of an opposite to autonomy. So the autonomy is the self-contained object, the ecology is the interrelation of all things. And I think this is one of the kind of figures that we need to begin to use, and one that Ruskin was proposing in his lecture on tree twigs, which is actually an allegory, like many of his lectures, on how we should each operate as individuals in relation to the whole, our duties as citizens and our duties as creative beings, and how we should operate accordingly and live our lives artistically and creatively, or at least as much as possible. It's not a coincidence that Ruskin's thought and influence moved far beyond art. That he's responsible, for example, for the initiation of the conservation movement, the preservation of Venice, organizations like Oxfam, the National Trust, and also is even considered as seeding some of the early ideas for the women's movement in the early 20th century. But in a way, examples of Ruskin at work include things like this, which is actually what I would argue like one of the first examples of socially engaged art practice. So Ruskin was Professor of Fine Art at Oxford University during his lifetime, on and off. And one of the first exercises he's got his students to do was to build a road, because he thought they should use their skills practically, that they should learn to have effect in the world. So this was a demonstration, this is one of his classes, where his students famously built a road between two villages. It was never finished, of course, like a lot of Ruskin projects. They were they set out to be, to have effect, but ultimately, due to personalities, due to circumstances, they never really came to full fruition. But nonetheless, he tasked his students with building a road, but also building the most beautiful road they'd ever built, with ferns and flowers and the absolute most exquisite road from which people could traverse between two villages. But also interestingly, because it was across a bog, so it would prevent the spread of cholera. So that was, in a way, that was the urgency that needed addressing in terms of arte utile. But also interestingly, that a lot of these students then went on to great things. So Canon Rawnsley, who set up the National Trust, Oscar Wilde, and Arnold Toynbee, who we'll come across later, who was another great social reformer. Now, at the same time, Ruskin, amongst his many projects and writings and travels and lectures, also started to think about the role of the institution, the role of the museum. And in something that I have personal experience of, he developed, where he lived in the village of Coniston, which is where I used to run the residency program I've spoken of, was where he lived in the latter part of his life from 1870 onwards. And he basically had a huge influence on the development of the Mechanics Institute in the village of Coniston, which was basically for the mining and farming population of this kind of semi-industrial village. And he created what was his version of the museum. as he did in a few other towns. But his version of the museum was one in which art was not for its own contemplation, art was a tool. So the art is combined with a library, and each work of art is used basically to illustrate an idea, to teach, to be a tool, not just to be there on the wall for observation. This is a picture of the Institute from the outside. But then combined with this, basically the toolkit inside the museum, which was the library, objects, artworks, drawings, natural history specimens, geology, were to give a complete education to the miners and their families. But at the same time, this was not just about education and looking, it was about learning through doing. Now, Ruskin sort of famously fell out with William Morris, who became, in a way, known as the chief advocate of the arts and crafts movement. But basically, Morris ended up making luxury goods for rich people. And this was what really kind of irked Ruskin to the core. So he reestablished his own idea of what he was originally talking about, which was that the people in the village would make art objects. They would make, so the men would do wood carving. I mean, this is still the 19th century. We're not got total emancipation here. Women would do spinning and weaving and produce lace, which he basically took this, he stole this as an idea from Athens, because obviously ancient Greek culture is a major kind of component in all this, and also copper work. And the idea of this was these were all readily available materials: wood, copper from the mines, and the lace, which was part of the whole British import-export business at the time. And through these handicrafts, people came together, they learned together, they made together, but the object was not to create goods for a niche market. The idea was to create goods for everyday life, to create objects in people's houses that they could live with, or maybe sell to their friends and relations or neighbors in order to make a bit of extra income. Primarily, the function of art here was to be educational and to be social and to bring the community together and to create practical objects that could be used in everyday life. And this is one of the greatest misunderstandings about the arts and crafts movement, was that it was essentially political. Ruskin's idea was that craft could be the way to change society from a very small base, working in the local, in the immediate, but nonetheless to have an impact on the way a society and a community functioned. These ideas spread. Canon Rawnsley, one of his students from the road building project at Oxford, created the Keswick School of Industrial Arts, which was an extension of these handicraft courses, which also then began to have an influence far and wide. Ruskin's famous book of 1852, Unto This Last, which is basically a critique of Adam Smith's economic theories, proposed a new way of living and based upon this thinking. And famously, Gandhi was handed a book of Unto This Last at a South African railway station quite early on in his life. And Gandhi himself produced an entire education system for the Indian lower classes based on these principles. But in Gandhi's terms, basically, people learnt agriculture, spinning, weaving, dyeing, and then through those processes, they learned about biology, chemistry, mathematics, etc., etc. The influence is also felt in things like Frank Lloyd Wright, who also is heavily influenced by Ruskin, not least because of his architecture and its influence from the arts and crafts philosophy, but also in creating communities. So this is Taliesin, which was sort of the first of Frank Lloyd Wright's experimental communities where people did farming and communal living and basically had a holistic approach to living concentrated around a kind of architectural structure. On from that, in the UK, the Toynbee settlement was created in the East End of London in Whitechapel, again on Ruskin's teachings. And the principle was in the East End of London, which was the poorest, most disenfranchised community in the capital, the settlement was created for Oxford and Cambridge students to live and work alongside that community, with the idea being that they would grow through mutual benefit. So the students would teach the local residents art, craft, basic household economics, law, all the competencies you need to learn to get on in life and kind of improve yourself, as the terminology of the time. But at the same time, the students learnt about real life, so to speak. They learnt about what the real issues and problems of society were, so that they could then, in their careers as politicians or in governance, could really start to shape society for the benefit of everybody. This idea was then picked up by Jane Addams in Chicago, around about the end of the 19th century, where she created the Hull House settlement in Chicago, which again took this model up in some of the most disenfranchised communities there, providing communal dining halls for people to kind of eat and learn together and to create better social conditions. Again, this kind of follows through ultimately with the Bauhaus, run on similar positions of a kind of holistic education system, which is about as much about kind of convening and dancing and coming together socially as it is necessarily about formal design, which also then starts to permeate around the world. This is Dartington Hall, a sort of medieval estate, which was taken over by a sort of, like many tough communist family from the UK, who set about creating a complete holistic education system with students in the Bauhaus. This is the schoolmaster's house by Walter Gropius in the grounds, and this is where basically students learnt art and craft and forestry and agriculture. And incidentally, Dartington is the origins of, it shows the origins of the organic movement, but also of GM crops. Through that agricultural program, this was developed. Other instances include, or spin-offs, are things like the Kibbo Kift movement from the 1930s, which was like a radical scouting movement that thought the scouts were too kind of military orientated. We should have like a back to nature, kind of Mother Earth, tree hugger scouting movement, and they were called the Kibbo Kift, but they kind of adopted kind of futurist aesthetics, and they had these kind of crazy costumes with tabards and, you know, Robin Hood hats and all sorts of stuff. But they also then became a political movement which campaigned for social credit. Famously, their great contribution to society is the invention of social credit systems. So you can kind of get a picture of these threads and stories that start to weave their way through the history of modernity, but nonetheless are buried. They're kind of kept down, because what they're all concerned with is using artistic processes, using art as a process for social change. Actually bringing resources together, bringing people together in creative circumstances to make something different, or to make a proposition of the world of how it might be otherwise. At certain moments, these movements, these collectives, these ideas are resurrected. Again, they feed back, you know, like the Bauhaus, clearly, but very soon they're captured back into the singular story of art that we're told, which is principally around the autonomous object, the autonomous role of art. Even the most radical political movements, nonetheless, are neutered of their political effect and presented as part of that singular narrative. So all these discussions and all this kind of archiving and digging around in the history of art culminated again in 2012 with a sort of a meeting of the various activists, you might say, of this idea of arte utile at its early stages. This is basically the team from the Van Abbey Museum visiting the Coniston Institute, really to see what was going on, and at the same time Tania visiting and us developing the criteria for arte utile, which 2 years later created the Museum of Arte Utile at the Van Abbey Museum, which we've already looked at. This is basically just an indicator of the kind of the live aspects of this. This is a project by Nerea Guel, who basically is she basically married a refugee so that he could gain legal status within Europe, but we then discovered that Charles Escher, the director of the Van Abbe Museum, had legal status to perform a divorce. So he basically was performing the divorce of the couple to kind of end the project and complete that transition. And then this is basically the management board of the Arte Útil Association plotting and planning away in London. So what's happened really since that particular moment in the Museum of Arte Útil is to start to get this corruptive idea, this messy idea of usefulness, of art operating in the world, of art not being disinterested, not losing its concerns of the day-to-day world, but absolutely bringing them into play and absolutely bringing them into focus back into the institution. Because one of the main problematics is the way that the architecture, both physical and conceptual, of the museum controls our behavior as spectators, as producers, as academics, whatever it might be. These very buildings are designed along the very same romantic principles that we've talked about, in that they have exhibition spaces, and then they have a separate education space, and they have a separate cafe. Basically, everything is working in service to the main lens of the institution, which is the exhibition space. So in a way, through Arte Útil, what we began to do was to kind of see if we could corrupt that compartmentalization of the institution and begin to move the institution from being an autonomous place to being an ecology, to functioning as an ecology. So examples of this include what we call offices of useful art, which we began to test out. So basically, we would insert offices of useful art as a kind of propaganda station within other exhibitions with other institutions. This is the first one we did in Tate, Liverpool, which was as part of an exhibition called When Art Turns Left. And then we created an office within the exhibition that ran for the full duration of the show, basically with discussions and activations and presentations of the archive to start to change the language in the institution and start to say that basically the exhibition space was the place of delivery of education, that art and education, art and functionality were not separate, but they were entwined together. This is in Birmingham, where we had making classes and community workshops and lectures and free lunches. And this is in Liverpool, John Moores University. This is in the Coniston Institute, which is a kind of original art and craft maker station. And then this kind of idea of kind of fucking up the museum and this other resurrection of these lost art histories manifests itself at the Van Abbe Museum a year after the Museum of Arte Útil, where I was involved in creating this exhibition called Confessions of the Imperfect, which is taken from a Ruskin essay of the same name. And really, this was an alternative history of art according to use value. So this was to start to tell the story through the museum of how we historically have used art in society outside of these normal readings. So it begins basically with the Industrial Revolution. This is Liam Gillick's simulation of the barricade of 1848. And apparently, not in France, but in the German revolutions of 1848, the Prussians would put paintings from the museums on the barricades because they believed the revolutionaries would not dare attack the city because there were paintings on the barricade, because they would be too cultured to actually kind of break through, which I'd like to think is true. But and just as a nod to this, we put a famous portrait of John Ruskin on the barricade, although we couldn't get the original, which is in the Oxford Ashmolean Museum. So we then had a copy made in Shenzhen in China for $87, hand-painted, life-size. So if you want to get a painting quickly made, Shenzhen is the largest producer of paintings in the world. They basically have an art factory where paintings are produced. But we, of course, credited the artist, although it took me about 6 weeks to find out the name of the actual guy who painted it, because they wanted to keep that quiet, so then we could sort of profiled the painting on those terms. And then we sort of basically re-articulated this history of art with union banners, with political action, and so on, and even a history of the cup in society, illustrated by a Hitachi robot, which would pour this. This is a Christopher Dresser teapot based on a Japanese wedding kettle, robotically pouring tea out amongst, basically the evolution of the cup in society as a kind of metaphor of this alternative history. And we illustrated it with kind of case studies from the archive as well. This is Stephen Wright, the guru of usership, who wrote the lexicon, with a project by Fernando Garcia Dori, which is a mobile dairy school. So this is a converted American military field unit converted into a cheese-making school. So this travels around, and there's Fernando, and he teaches communities how to make cheese. This is the cheese going. This is in Coniston, with the cheese being lowered into Ruskin's ice house in the grounds of his house, producing this fine cheese, kind of a version of Wensleydale. But this cheese school now travels around the world. If you want a cheese school, you can borrow this unit, and you can teach how to make cheese. Incidentally, this was also another of Ruskin's projects. This was basically a project that he proposed and was implemented by his disciples, if you like, in the 19th century, because he realized that people had forgotten how to make cheese and make food for themselves. So he instigated this project in order to reintroduce cheese back into society. So if that's not an urgency, I don't know what is. This is the Arte Útil archive on show in Zagreb, where also Hema and Alessandra, also alongside the offices, began to operate these kind of teaching projects, in a way, a kind of articulation and propagation of the archive that was called Broadcasting the Archive, that's still going on today. And then also, again, this idea starts to spread. This is the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, with a show they produced called Making Use, which is really another take on this idea of Arte Útil. So while it's not Arte Útil itself, what they're interested in doing is proposing and looking at projects that are specifically outside of the realm of art, or when these projects go beyond art into activism, into kind of art-like moments, but not necessarily defined under the umbrella of art. And I think that's something we're still teasing with. I for myself, I am in favor of including non-art projects within the Arte Útil archive, but we're having this debate at the moment, that's fair to say. And this is a nice little drawing they produced for the exhibition, which illustrates the idea in a way of not thinking, this is an important point, and it refers back to the sound piece that we listened to. This is not about escaping the current situation, knocking down the current museum and starting again. That's the avant-gardist approach. Destroy the museum, destroy the art, start again. This is actually about repurposing, hacking, piggybacking, taking the museum and bending it rather than laying waste to what was before. And this is examples in Museum of Modern Art Warsaw, where they were experimenting with turning the galleries into gardens, of taking works that had been made, basically insurance write-offs that were art and then had become non-art, in effect. So then representing the non-art within these circumstances. And here's the Arte Útil archive on display. And here is the sign for the Office of Useful Art at MIMA, which is kind of now a permanent part of our organization. So on the first floor of the museum, we have the administration offices, and then in a mirror adjacent to it is the Office of Useful Art, and in a way is the public office of the organization, the public place where we disseminate this idea, but also start to restructure the museum alongside these terms. And in a way that's what we're now beginning to implement, is how can we take these ideas and these ways of working and apply them to a museum wholeheartedly. So this is not about doing an exhibition, but run the whole institution, all its mechanisms, according to these criteria. And I'm going to come into that later on. Interestingly, to show the effect of this, because one question might be, well, what, even just doing these offices, doing the broadcast in the archive, what is the effect of this? How do we make sure it's no longer just an exhibition? And I think a good example, certainly from my home turf, was in the city of Liverpool, which is an existing project that we profiled. And this is a guy called Michael Simon, who's the leader or one of the main players in a community land trust in Liverpool. And in the 1980s, in Liverpool, there was basically an infamous moment in the 80s when the area of Toxteth, which had been neglected and abandoned basically by the sort of Margaret Thatcher's policies. She called basically Liverpool the last twitching arm of socialism. They planned to close the city down because it was basically a socialist enclave, and it wasn't really playing ball with the neoliberal agenda that was emerging. It was the heartland of kind of socialist movements. Out of that kind of crisis in this community, this neglected community, they formed a housing trust, a land trust, in which rather than being evicted from their houses and houses being bulldozed to be built for new developments, regeneration, etc., which has happened in Liverpool subsequently, this last island of kind of, the original population has been left standing. They basically started to run the streets themselves. So even when the city withdrew the services of trash collection, of street sweeping, of police patrols even, they continued to maintain and look after their neighborhood and keep it alive, even though there were only maybe about 4 or 5 people living on this one street. And over time, this started to gain traction. And interestingly, a few years ago, they invited a sort of artist-architect collective called Assemble to come and work with them to start to redevelop the houses on their own terms. So rather than bringing in a developer or looking to higher powers or even wanting to, because a lot of developers are really just producing housing to make money. As we all know, this is not about making homes, this is about kind of making capital. They would work with Assemble to repurpose the houses and redevelop the houses the way they wanted them to be. And not just at a base level, but in a way, in a beautiful level, an exquisite level, where the aesthetics, where the look, where the feel was something that they co-created. And not only did Assemble kind of take this on as a project, but they then worked to create what's called the Granby 4 Streets Project and the Granby Workshop, where with the residents, they started to make basically the detritus of urban decline into the new housing. So that the broken bricks were turned into a composite terrazzo, like a Liverpool version of terrazzo, which was then made into fireplaces or lintels. They made furniture out of the discarded wood. They printed textiles from wood blocks, basically starting to make the houses on their own terms with the materials around them. This culminated actually in a way, a kind of convergence with this idea of Arte Útil, as I was using it as a case study, and them actually operating it on the ground. This is interesting. This is a display in the Turner Prize exhibition in 2015. Because basically I thought, well, could we get an art? That year I was on the jury for the Turner Prize, which is the big UK art prize. And I thought, well, could I get an Arte Útil project to win the Turner Prize? That would be the moment when we really broke the mainstream. And sure enough, after a bit of battling, you know, a bit like, oh, go on then, you can have one in, but, you know, that's it. We got assembled onto the Turner Prize shortlist, which of course fitted in with the kind of controversial, you know, kind of media attention they like to help sell the, you know, sell the thing. And then this is the display, basically creating one of the houses from Liverpool with all the fabrics and textiles and furniture produced by the residents through the workshop, which of course then gets sold as products as well on the market through a website, and then the money goes back to the community. So in a way, this is a way to put Arte Útil on a stage and to say this is, you know, for years, I think when Stephen Wright maybe was talking about usership 10 years ago, he was seen as a bit of a lunatic in the art world and dismissed as a kind of friendly, crazy guy. And I think if, you know, certainly in the early days of me, you know, when we were talking about John Ruskin and use value, this was poo-pooed and shot down in kind of academic discussions. But bit by bit, by showing the historical context, telling the stories, advocating for this kind of work, it started to break through. And then after apparently the longest jury meeting ever, Assemble won the Turner Prize. And interestingly, at that particular night when they were awarded the moment, I was finger jabbed by dealers from around the London art scene saying, "You've fucking broken art. You've ruined it. This isn't," and you know, literally art dealers saying, "This isn't art. It can't be art. We can't sell it. You've taken art away from the market. You've made this, you know, kind of hippie, happy, socially engaged art project. It wasn't even made by artists. It was made by a community and some, you know, kind of architect students, whatever it was, and a collective, you know, all the things that is not, in a way, not tolerated, finally sort of broken through." Anyway, I said, don't worry, it'll be business as usual next year, and it was. So this is the lexicon, and I'm going to go on next to talk about, how long have we got left? Got about half an hour. What I might do is I might whiz through some projects to show you what we mean by the Museum 3.0, at least how in Middlesbrough we're trying to make this a reality and make it happen, how to actually implement it. And this is a work in progress. This is not a done deal. There are flaws, there are inconsistencies, but I think if I could probably talk you through what we're actually trying to do, how we're trying to make the criteria fit an institution, that will lead us into some fruitful discussions over the next couple of days. I just want to, do you want to break for 5 minutes, or do you want to carry on? You know, a quick break? Because I know it's a bit of an overload. Let's have a 5-minute break. Hi.
I have a point of information question, which is not fit for the whole group. What was this Radical Scouts?
The Kibbo Kift.
How do you Kibbo Kift?
Yeah. Okay, should we reconvene? Okay. Is it okay? Still awake? Okay, right, I'm gonna start. Just to try and keep on time. Thank you. Okay, so that's the art history bit, kind of. And now I'm going to talk about how the hell you kind of put this into practice, or try to, and kind of these are stories of how we've been trying to do that. And underpinning this is this concept of the Museum 3.0, which is articulated in the lexicon, and which is about the idea of the museum established upon usership rather than spectatorship. And this is actually a slide taken from the presentation I did at my job interview, when I basically was proposing this idea of running the museum according to useful art, and it should be a kind of a useful museum rather than a useless museum, which is how the community saw it. And the image is taken from the Nintendo Wii Plaza, which is sort of illustrative of the usership generation. But the way I kind of term Museum 3.0 in kind of layman's terms is Museum 1.0 is you put the beautiful objects in the museum in isolation, and the people come in and somehow they're enlightened or better off for witnessing or engaging with the objects. This is like the Victorian model. Museum 2.0 is probably a more recent, maybe 80s, 90s thing, where people come in the museum and they participate in the art. They may be involved in its co-production. Basically, the audience, still called audience, are engaged, but nonetheless, they're still participating in someone else's agenda, i.e. an agenda derived from the curators, from the art world, from the market, etc., etc. So the Museum 3.0 goes beyond that and proposes a museum in which its meaning is created by the sum usership of its users. So the agenda is set not by the connoisseurs, not by necessarily the curators, but by an ecology of users who have different interests at stake. So these are interested spectators rather than disinterested ones. But I realized that when I went for my job interview, it would be kind of hypocritical to go forward with a presentation of all the exhibitions I was going to do, because that's not the way the model works. That's like the old model. You go around Venice Biennale and Documenta and the Armory, and then you go, oh yeah, I have one of those, and do a show with that guy, do a show with that guy, do one of those, and you've got 5 years of program. We can't run an institution like that. That's not how it should work. So I said, well, what I will do is we don't know what the program will be. but we need to evolve that with our constituents, but nonetheless we will have a set of values and aims which will drive our program. And they were laid out as our values, as art as a process, it's a tool, it's an education, it's for the everyday, not for the exceptional, it's for everybody, not the art elite or the 1%. Art is how you do something, not what it is. And history as proposing history as something only exists in the present and how we use it ourselves, not as something that's given and dictated to us from the past. And that the aims of the organization should be a holistic educational approach. So the function of the institute itself is educational. That you don't have separate curatorial teams and separate educational teams, but there's one program, and they all work together with the same agenda. We shouldn't be a neutral space, because that was the language of the old museum, right? It was a neutral space. We didn't take part in politics, we didn't have opinions, we just present the objects and the artifacts, and you decide, what it means. But we should be intersubjective. And as a consequence of that, artists have more to bounce off and be involved with than necessarily just being given the free space to do whatever they want. On the back of that, we would actually become a kind of leading institution nationally, internationally, because of the way we were working specifically in the local, not because we were participating in the kind of the international regime. And therefore, as a consequence, we would be kind of exporting culture, not importing it, which in terms of kind of psychology and behavior in a community like Middlesbrough is really important. If you become a dependent culture, which is what we saw with the steelworks, then the psychological impact of that is really devastating. And then this would in turn contribute to the local economy and the ecology, and we should also make everything a project. So the cafe should be an art project, the shop should be an art project, the garden should be an art project, the education program should be an art project, everything should be a project. Nothing is just a service. And as an institution, we wanted to respond to the criteria and re-establish this idea of aesthetics and wrestle it away from that Kantian paradigm and make aesthetics this field of operations and process in which we are engaged. And that way you actually advocate to the point where people do value the museum, that they see what a museum does by what it transforms. But we had to do something in the first instance, and the kind of first shot across the bows was to kind of do what I conceived as like the antidote to the international blockbuster. So after 7 years of the exhibition showing the great and the good from Gerhard Richter, Louise Bourgeois, Carl Andre, whoever you like, we should do a project that really was a kind of manifesto for how we would work. And we did a project called Localism, which was really taking a piss out of right-wing conservative politics in the UK around about that time. And we kind of stole some of the graphics from the Socialist Worker newspaper that was had its heyday in the 1980s, particularly in Liverpool. Basically, the idea was to crowdsource a history of art in Middlesbrough with the public, with our constituents. So we would basically create a narrative in the museum of the history of art in the town, of artists who came from the town, who've worked in the town, its influence in the town. But we would do an open call for suggestions and do workshops to gather that material and information to create the show. And not only would the show open with this material, but we would continue to add to the exhibition as it went along. So people would come along and go, oh yeah, my Uncle Albert, he had a studio down such and such a road. You've not got him in, so we'll get him in the show. So we did sort of call outs with the local newspaper, and people brought things in, including kind of Communist Party banners. But we showed archives, the local newspaper, we made a timeline, films, the original drawings for the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which was made in Middlesbrough, and then we even made our own Alfred Barr diagram according to Middlesbrough. So basically this is the history of art in Middlesbrough done as a kind of Alfred Barr diagram with a room in the show that was actually live for doing local history projects, presentations, talks, meetings, and so on. And then the show itself also became this kind of crazy warehouse of stuff that accumulated during the show, with not only new stuff, like stuff made by art studios, stuff we didn't like, some stuff we did like all the people who normally bang on the museum door going, oh, you never show local artists, you never show our stuff. Okay, get in, be in the show, it's fine. And then more historical things like this is amazing. This is a display of Linthorpe pottery, which was a 19th century useful art project initiated by Christopher Dresser, kind of well-known designer, the first product designer, you might say, who took, basically the project was to take the clay from the Middlesbrough ground, which is brick clay, and turn it into fine ceramic wares that could be exported around the world and create employment for the community. This is these original Linthorpe wares from the local museum and from some people's houses, and we basically exhibited these in a format which was of the as they were shown in a New Orleans exhibition of 1882. Which was kind of this crazy kind of showcase style. But interestingly, this was an idea of using the red brick clay. They all said, no, you can't make fine art out of that. You can't do that. They persisted with it as a kind of against all logics to create these ceramics. But then at the same time during the show, we also worked with two local artists, importantly local artists. One called Emily Hesser and James Baton, who created new Linthorpe pottery, and they were taking the same clay from the ground. If you remember the bulldozed houses, so from that site, taking clay from the earth, processing it, and turning it into new ceramics. But also at the same time, in the show, having an actual ceramic studio, which would teach people how to make ceramics using this clay, Middlesbrough clay from the ground, which kind of took off a bit like wildfire, and that we were sort of fighting people back to come and do, make these workshops and make this clay and make these products. But again, in a way with this Ruskinian principle, that it's not necessarily just about what the things look like, it's about the coming together, having that moment to kind of discuss the issues of the day, to convene, to talk about the issues of the day, whilst at the same time developing a kind of alternative ceramics industry. We also resurrected another project. I mean, in a way, this idea of history is quite interesting in the museum as well, because I see history in the same light in terms of Arte Útil. So history only exists in the present and in how we use it in our present with the materials available. I think it's, the famous quote is about history is only the detritus left in the sieve that we have after time has run through. So how do we remake history in our present to serve our own ends and plan the future? That's only how we ever manage to encapsulate our sense of history. And so this is a project that we also highlighted in the show from the 1930s in Middlesbrough, which was basically a sort of, again, another tough communist family who lived in the big house. And when unemployment was at 90% in the Great Depression, they said, what can we do? How can we respond to the current urgencies? And they set up a kind of work camp for unemployed miners, teaching them agriculture and horticulture. And then they also brought in Michael Tippett, who was then a young composer, who then became sort of a kind of great modernist composer, to teach them music. And they wrote an opera for the miners to perform about Robin Hood, which was like a quasi-communist manifesto in disguise about redistribution of wealth. And they also brought in Wilfrid Franks, who, interesting, was a member of the Kibbo Kift I mentioned earlier, who then was sent to the Bauhaus in Germany to learn furniture design, and then was sent back by Maholy-Nagy, sent back to the UK to kind of be a communist infiltrator in Britain. He ended up in Middlesbrough and taught the miners how to make furniture. So they made this sort of quasi-Bauhaus furniture, which they then sold in London in a department store, and the money went back to the community as a sort of social enterprise project. A nice little twist in the tale is that Wilfrid and Michael had a love affair during this time, in the sort of 3-year period between the wars, and even when it was illegal, but they were nurtured by this mining community. So we've subsequently been kind of developing this project further, and we're going to remake the opera, which hasn't been performed since 1934, with a kind of a community choir, etc. But what we did basically was, again, with artist Adam Clark, who's again a local artist, not a kind of imported artist, start again new Bousbecque Industries, because it was called Bousbecque Industries, this idea, and teach furniture making design to unemployed, teaching design skills, but with new technology. Because in a way where the arts and crafts movement failed, and where original Bousbecque failed, was the labor of production became too onerous in order to keep it affordable. So basically, new Bousbecque teaches design through computer-aided design and through CNC cutting techniques to produce versions of the Bousbecque furniture, which then gets sold as the same kind of community cooperative basis. But then also furnished our atrium, our entrance to our museum, and the shop using these skills. So you can sit down and have a cup of coffee and eat your dinner at a table, and then buy the table or the bench afterwards, etc. So this is the idea of making everything a project. So the shop becomes a project that sells products made through the learning programs, made through the craft workshops, made through design and technology, made through whatever means necessary. And the actual function of the museum starts to be created by the projects themselves. Now, another sort of demonstration of how this might work in an extended format and using artists who aren't local was number 513 from the archive, which was a contentious project. It was in the original Museum of Arte Útil, was one of the controversies, and this is a project initiated by Dutch artist Renzo Martins, who made a film you all must watch called Enjoy Poverty. We have to sort of watch it between kind of your hands like this. But basically, he's an artist who has been working for some time in the Congo, next Belgian colony of Congo, with the plantation workers, one of the poorest places on the planet. And interestingly, basically he calls it a reverse gentrification project, where he's basically trying to redirect the resources of the contemporary art world and the market back into the Congo. Because in his opinion, in a way, a lot of art projects talk about the injustices of the world, but then they use it to enforce their own cultural capital. So you do a project about how shit things are in Africa with photographs or installations, but ultimately then you just show it at Lehman Morpin in New York, and you'd kind of take 20,000, 30,000 back home for the pleasure of it. So this is really about actually redirecting those resources, even though it's flawed and it's incredibly complicated and very controversial. But working with the plantation workers, he has basically created a Plantation Workers Art League. This is one of his first projects, where the plantation workers, he got them basically making sculptures out of the Congolese river mud, the River Congo mud. And interestingly, this is the same community that produced the tribal art that influenced Braque and Picasso around in our 1907 moment. But at the same time, the plantation workers were banned from producing these sculptures because it was taking them away from their work. And interestingly, the plantation owner was Lord Leverhulme, who was producing palm oil for Lever Brothers, who produced soap and detergents in the West. And Lord Leverhulme in Liverpool itself created a kind of ideal community for his workers. And then went on to support the Tate Turbine Hall commissions that were kind of throughout the kind of, from 2000 on. So this is about kind of redressing the balance in some way. So these sculptures, basically, they're 3D scanned, they're 3D printed in Holland, and then they're cast in chocolate and sold on the market through the contemporary art system. For about sort of $6,000 to $10,000 each, probably they'll go up. And then basically the money then goes back to the plantation workers for projects there. This is Renzo with Stephen Tintier from the Van Abbe Museum, the show we did in the Confessions of the Imperfect show. There's Renzo looking, he has this look. I won't go into that now, but it's quite hilarious. With a sculpture called The Art Collector, which we actually bought from Mima as we acquired the work, and then also so that we became implicated in the process. This is the show of the sculptures in Mima. And interestingly, what we did until that point, Renzo had always shown the sculptures as Renzo Martin sculptures, and we were conscious that in a way, if we were going to really start to push the ideas we're talking about, that really this should be presented as work made by the plantation workers. So the show was billed as a show by the Congolese Plantation Workers Art League, and Renzo's name only featured in small writing somewhere down the bottom in the credits list. And so that it really started to push this idea of kind of an expanded idea of the artist, but nonetheless still operating in and through the museum. And interestingly, we then worked with the show with Congolese refugees and communities in Middlesbrough who suddenly had to buy into the idea of the museum as something that was at stake that they could actually be involved with. And following on from this, we started to basically generate shows which would respond to current urgencies. So this was not shows dictated to us by the art world, but what are the issues in Middlesbrough? So migration is a big issue, the closure of the steelworks is a big issue, domestic violence is a big issue, lack of housing is an issue, attainment of children at age 5 is the worst in the country in Middlesbrough, all these kind of things. These are the issues that should drive our program. So our program responds to these urgencies, and that's what steers and develops in consultation and in conversation with our users. That's what drives the program. And in a way, the first example was this show with the longest title ever of "If all relations were to reach equilibrium, then this building would dissolve," which was a title of a piece that I did when I worked with Liam Gillick on the Home Office building. This was a public art program for the new Home Office building in London in the year 2002. And it was going to be a text that was on the front of the building, but the government decided it was too pretentious to have on the front of their building, so it got scrapped. So then I sort of thought, well, it'd be a great name for a show basically about domestic policy. So the idea was to address the situation that I talked about before with the red doors. And we worked with basically the residents of that community, and we worked with migrants and asylum seekers to basically, sorry, these really bad slides, to create the exhibition, which was of artworks made by international artists who were basically in situations of asylum or migration, etc., but also to show works made by these local residents, but also to actually establish the exhibition space not as an area of spectacle, but to make it a working resource for their needs. So we basically started to do free lunch every week within the exhibition space, English classes, education spaces, conferences. We made a film with a local artist, Isabel Lima, about basically advocating their issues, their side of the story, which had been suppressed by the media, about the state of migrant labor. We had the Arte Útil summit there last year, alongside, and there's Tania talking in the Arte Útil summit, but also we did other projects with charities and support mechanisms for these groups, but always the idea that this was not a show with an end. This was the beginning of actually getting the museum to work with these users on their terms continuously into the future, as we would with other groups. So you start to grow a usership, grow constituencies rather than grow an audience, which is normally the expectations of governance. So they've developed our garden as a kind of community growing space where they get together and they meet. That then feeds into our cafe, which is an art project, which then produces with their kind of catering wing of the local asylum seeker charity, a communal lunch, which happens every Thursday, which then becomes part of a community day, which is basically a whole program of activities for these users, which in a way they start to direct. They have a cinema club that they run, they have craft classes, there's all kinds of things that they do, but it's them in a way beginning to operate the museum and seeing how they can use the museum to their benefit, politically and practically. This is the new Linthorpe project. Again, we don't just kind of discard that, but incorporate it, feed it back into the system. So this is featured on TV. This is them using the Office of Useful Art at MIMA to work with Eritrean refugees with continuing this ceramics workshop, because the Eritreans said that they could no longer get Eritrean coffee pots. They couldn't find them in the shops. So we said, oh, let's make some. Let's work with you, and then you could start making your own coffee services. So they're basically the whole load of projects to kind of design and make these pots, which were then produced, and then this allows them then to have their Eritrean coffee service, etc. And then on the back of this is also kind of just to, in a way, keep the momentum going of this continuum of activity and allowing this continuum, in a way, to start to replace the kind of cycle of exhibition programs, but they're folded in to the ongoing political action of the institution. So this is a show that opened week came before last, which is basically a show with 80s black artists from the UK. This is some of them giving talks at the opening. But again, not just a show for its own sake, but to start to retell these stories and use the museum as a vehicle to give a platform for voices and for narratives that, again, have been suppressed or are not permitted. And alongside this, then begin to talk about and advocate for politics happening at the same time and how we can start to have a role in those. So alongside the 80s Black Art show is a show about Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and basically how we got to the mess we're in now. Using archive footage. This is Margaret Thatcher in Middlesbrough in 1987 on the ruins of one of the steelworks when she was campaigning to just basically turn the whole place into a call centre. And so this is archive material gathered with local historians and again people offering stuff, bringing stuff into the museum alongside this great. This is Keith Piper. Another one of the artists from the 1980s with his 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse that was shown at the ICA in 1980, not been shown since. Been in his attic, I mean this says a lot about black art in Britain, the status of it. It's been in his attic for 30 years and we kind of got it down and this amazing piece, that's Ronald Reagan. It's on the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And then Daniela Ortiz, also another show. So this is again driving the project to work for our constituents. So this is Daniela Ortiz, who made a show called An ABC of Racist Europe. So this again was about addressing the kind of injustices of the system. She worked with this local Iraqi refugee to make these paintings of borders, which were shown in the show. But interestingly, he now wants to be, does anyone know Bob Ross, the guy that does the paints? So basically, Omid wants to be like the refugee Bob Ross. So now I was talking to him the other day about, okay, let's make you like the refugee Bob Ross. This could, and to help you claim asylum, basically, to get kind of worker status. And then she also, with basically single mothers seeking asylum in Middlesbrough, she remade this book, which is from 1899, called An ABC for Baby Patriots. And you can see the kind of colourful fare. I mean, this is really, you talk about decolonizing the museum. We'll talk about decolonizing the museum later on. But this is, for example, the entry for K from 1899. K is for kings. Once warlike and haughty, Great Britain subdued them because they'd been naughty. And you can kind of tell from the imagery what's going on there. So she worked basically with this group to remake the book. I can send you a link actually to the book, but this is from their perspective. This is K. Racialized people know that racist social services kidnap Roman kids using racist arguments, etc., etc. So this is really kind of quite hard-hitting stuff. So she made that as a children's book, and she made another book called There's a Monster Under My Bed, which is about kind of the racialized conditions of the UK. And then they were presented in the show, and we had a visit from the police, because somebody complained that the show was racist to white people, which I think is impossible, right? But anyway, we had this debate. We managed to keep the show open under certain conditions. But then interestingly, the chief of police, who was called up, said, actually, this is really good. What we need to know, we really need to know about refugees and asylum seekers. We need to understand their condition. We don't know how to do that, but you're working with them all the time. You're doing it. So how can we work with you to use the museum to actually start to work through some of these problems? Similarly, we've, in a way, started to apply this logic to the collection. So we have a collection of over 2,500 works. And then our collections place, again, were then crowdsourced, working with asylum seeker groups, working with schools, basically asking people what they think should be on show, and then starting to drive the agenda and doing the interpretation. Again, we also responded to the closure of the steelworks, the show about the end of the steel industry, to, in a way, give kind of respite, or to kind of have some sort of sense of closure, but also to propose new possibilities. So it was really about looking at the history of the steelworks, but also proposing new industries going forward. So the museum became this place in which we could start to introduce and advocate for new industries that people might take up and start to develop possibilities, including this group of unemployed steelworkers. We did a workshop with them around, an artist who'd done a proposed scheme for the future site of the steelworks that has actually now evolved into a genuine working group to start to come up with proposals for the future of the steelworks, and for me to then become on the board of the local enterprise partnership and the combined authority. So in a way, the museum starts to take on a governance role and actually an active political, economic, social function within the valley. What I'm doing, I'm going to stop there because we're going to pick up on some of these things now, but it kind of gives you an idea of ways of testing out situations where basically you move away from the representative function into actualizing the museum. So whilst on the one hand, this still is a museum with a collection, still with galleries, it nonetheless is making all those different components work in the real and actually starting to be vehicles for testing and developing and attracting ideas for what might be possible for implementation, but also involved in implementation in reality beyond the museum walls. I'll leave you with a cartoon by Pablo Higuera. Thank you. Have you got a mic?
How are you funding the museum? How is the museum going to stay afloat? Or what's its funding source?
It's basically our core operations. There's three ways. We're like 1/3 from the university. We're part of the university now. It wasn't when I joined, the museum got taken over by a university because it was in such a perilous state that the council, with austerity and pressure on why the hell we got an art gallery and we should be having a hospital, a school, it was handed to the university. So we have basically 1/3 university, 1/3 arts council, which is like National Endowment for the Arts, and 1/3 the local council. Still, they reduced their funding, but they still put in some money. So that kind of covers with a few bits and pieces, covers our baseline, trusts and foundations. But what's interesting now is because we're starting to actually get involved in the operational side of the region, outside the museum, we're starting to get funding from businesses or NGOs to actually deliver projects. So for example, we just started a project with that's funded by a private housing provider who we're basically working with their residents that are over 55, particularly those with dementia, basically to deliver a program which it basically improves the conditions of life within their residence. But that's funded by basically a private housing funder. They're also actually now we're looking at more projects with them. We're actually beginning to get involved in projects around house building. So this area of Gresham, where the streets were bulldozed, we're also now doing projects there to try and, for example, we're going to try and get for Binny, who's the leader of the asylum seeker charity, for his charity to get 2 houses that they can actually refurbish themselves, and then one will kind of become a sort of makerspace learning center, and the other one of how to refurbish houses, but then also we can kind of run one as a sort of alternative hotel, which brings in an income for them, or maybe a restaurant. So you basically start to, it's kind of starting to develop the settlement model, but implementing the museum in the town. But this is the really crucial thing. It's not, in a way, getting the public to participate in the museum, it's getting the museum to participate in public. So in a way, what we're seeing is the opening up of kind of resources existing resources in the town available to kind of art projects, to the point where the council will go, oh yeah, well we put these, you know, kind of street furnishings in to stop people joyriding, but it doesn't work. So why don't we give that money to you and then you can come up with a project? Or, you know, we can't get people to stay in these, you know, social housing projects. So why don't we give you the money that normally goes to these housing projects to do something, you know? So that's starting to, yeah, happen.
I used to work in a museum an art museum where there was a lot of contention between the education department and the curatorial department in terms of re-envisioning the role between the museum and the public in this kind of more socially engaged way. And I'm curious, particularly with the curatorial staff kind of feeling threatened, I'm curious how the staff and the board responded to some of these changes and just how they received kind of this re-envisioning of the museum.
Well, that split between curatorial and educational is universal. Like every museum I know, you know, the curators look down on the educator people, and the educator people look, you know, kind of pissed off with the creative people because they really know the answers, and the creative people just go shopping around the art world for their highfalutin fancy things, et cetera, et cetera. The classic thing happened is when I gave my sort of opening pitch presentation at the, you know, my interview, all the staff went, yay, this is great, this is what we've always wanted. And then, you know, as you sort of move on, they go, oh, we didn't mean that radical. We didn't think you meant it, you know. And so actually what happens, I mean, again, it's a work in progress, but what happens is that these things start to be worked through by actually doing projects, because you can talk about it, but then it's not until you actually start to do the things and demonstrate what we're talking about that it really, that it really, you know, gains traction, and those boundaries are. So there's still a little bit of it, it's fair to say, but there are moments where people are starting to go, oh yeah, this is starting to feel like what it might be. So, for example, you know, this community day that we do, the garden, you know, the projects actually starting to operate in the real. I think that's when people go, oh yeah, you know, this is actually starting to happen. But it's only 3 years in, and I said it would take 7 years for it to fully. Actually, I think for something to fully transform, that's how long it takes, I think, to kind of wash through the system.
Kind of a side note, but what was the last piece of autonomous art that like bowled you over, or does that happen anymore to you? Do you have the romantic response to?
No, because I've stopped looking at art autonomously. And in fact, we're going to do an exercise tomorrow. But to answer that is, I've stopped. I always see art now through a user matrix. So in a way, no matter how much someone says this is useless and autonomous, I go, well, no, actually it's not. Like, you know, rich people know how to use art really well, right? So yeah, we can work on that tomorrow. I'm conscious it's 8 o'clock. We'll have to get kicked out of the building, but we're going to, obviously, it's a school. You know, we're on this all week, but we can pick up tomorrow anyway, and thanks very much. The revolution!